All right, so you've given us like this whole stack of research, and it's all
Oh,
about reading and how we teach it, right?
yeah.
Specifically in those early grades, K through 3.
Yep, that's right.
And something that keeps popping up, kind of like a big red flag, I guess you could say, is this whole idea of treatment fidelity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super important.
So I guess for anyone listening, think of it this way. Did the reading help? The actual interventions, were they really done the way the researchers planned them out?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, are we really doing what we said we were going to do?
Yeah.
Sometimes you see it called treatment integrity or fidelity of implementation. But basically, it all boils down to that how well did the real world teaching match the fancy research plan?
Okay, I get it. But why should, anyone listening who's digging through all this research, why should they really care about this fidelity thing? I mean, if a study says, hey, this program works, isn't that good enough?
Well, not always. And this is where it gets interesting, right? So let's say you've got a study and it's telling you some reading intervention is a miracle worker. Kids are improving like crazy. But here's the catch. They didn't really check if the teachers were actually doing the program exactly as planned.
Oh, I see.
So were those great results really because of the program itself? Or is it maybe the teacher's awesome personality or some other thing they did?
Uh-huh. So it's like you got to make sure you're actually testing what you think you're testing.
Precisely. And it goes way beyond research, too.
Yeah.
Think about schools, right? They're trying to use programs that have evidence to back them up. It's a big deal with all those laws like No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act.
Right. They're trying to do what really works, what's been proven.
Exactly.
Mm.
But imagine this. A school picks a program, puts it in place, but doesn't really follow it closely. Then, surprise, they don't see the amazing results they were promised. Now they're stuck. Is it the program's fault, or did they just mess up the delivery? Tough to know.
Yeah, that makes it really hard to figure out what actually works.
You got it.
So for this deep dive, what we're doing is zeroing in on treatment fidelity in studies about reading interventions. Specifically, we're looking at studies that were about kids in those early grades, K through 3, who are like struggling readers or at risk of falling behind. And the time period we're focused on is studies published between 1995 and 2015.
That's a pretty big chunk of research. It's like 175 studies in total.
Yeah, a whole lot. So what we really want to understand, and what will help anyone listening make sense of all this, is how did these studies support treatment fidelity? Like, what did they actually do? How did they measure it? And what did they say about it?
Right. Those are the key questions.
And I know you mentioned something kind of interesting, a little tidbit before we started recording that really sets the scene for all this.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Even though treatment fidelity is like super important for all those reasons we just talked about, it wasn't always reported in these studies. And when it was reported, they often just looked at one tiny piece of it.
Oh, okay. So maybe some missing pieces for people to keep in mind as they go through these studies.
Exactly.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. First things first. In those 175 studies, how often did the researchers actually say something about treatment fidelity?
Well, the overall number is pretty eye-opening.
Oh.
And, something to keep in mind as you're going through this research. Less than half, just 47% of those studies reported any data on treatment fidelity at all.
Wow.
Whether it was like a specific number or just some general comments, that's it, less than half. Which means that in more than half of these studies, we have no clue if the interventions were done the right way. It's a big blind spot.
Less than half, huh? That's kind of shocking when you think about how crucial it is. But you also looked at whether this changed over time, right? Like, did newer studies do a better job of reporting it?
Yeah, we did. And this part is a bit more promising, for anyone looking at those more recent studies. We saw a real increase in reporting treatment fidelity over the years. So back in the early days, from 1995 to 99, only about 27% of studies reported it.
Oh, wow, even lower.
But jump ahead to 2010 to 2015, and that number shoots up to 61%. So it seems like researchers are realizing it's important.
Okay, so maybe some progress there. Good to know. What else made a difference in whether or not a study mentioned treatment fidelity? Did the way the study was designed, did that play a role?
Oh, absolutely. The research design seemed to make a big difference. So single case studies, they were the best. They had the highest reporting rate, 69%. Then you had experimental studies with 58% reporting fidelity data.
Okay.
Quasi-experimental studies came in at 31%, and those treatment comparison studies, they were at the bottom of the pack, only 30%.
That's interesting. Why do you think those single case studies were so much more likely to report fidelity?
Well, I think it has to do with the nature of those studies. Single case designs, they often involve really closely watching an intervention, but with just a few
So
participants.
it's like a really focused look at how things work for each individual.
Exactly. And the whole goal is to show that, boom, this intervention led to this outcome, and it's super clear for each person. So obviously they got to document really carefully whether the intervention was done exactly as planned. It's key for making those connections.
Makes sense. Now, what about those differences between experimental and quasi-experimental designs? What should people keep in mind about those varying reporting rates?
Okay, so with experimental studies, which usually use randomization, they kind of shuffle things up to make it fair, and they have those super controlled conditions, right? Their main focus is what we call internal validity, making sure it was the intervention that really caused any changes they saw. So reporting treatment fidelity is like their way of proving that connection.
Right. Got to eliminate all those other possible explanations.
It's exactly. But quasi-experimental designs, they don't randomize, so they might have a tougher time ruling out other things that could be affecting the results.
Mm.
And maybe, just maybe, treatment fidelity isn't as high on their priority list. So for anyone listening, that lower reporting rate in those designs, it's a yellow flag. Be careful about the conclusions they're drawing.
Good point. So the study design matters. What about the people actually doing the teaching, the interventionists? Did that make a difference in fidelity reporting?
It did, at first glance anyway. Studies with paraprofessionals, those folks who assist teachers, they had a higher reporting rate, something like 78%. But here's the weird thing. It seems like this higher rate was mostly due to one specific researcher who just happened to study paraprofessionals a lot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and when we took that researcher's studies out of the mix, the reporting rate for those paraprofessional-led interventions dropped down to around 46%, much closer to the average.
Huh. So it wasn't really about the paraprofessionals themselves, more like one researcher's specific interest. Important detail to remember. What else did you examine?
We also dug into the students' grade level. So those studies that zeroed in on first graders, they were the most diligent about reporting faculty at 62%.
Okay.
But studies that lumped together students from different grades, they were the least likely to mention fidelity, only 28%. Though, gotta admit, this could be tied to the types of research designs they used. Just more things to think about when you're interpreting those results.
Yeah, those confounding factors can be tricky. What about the journals themselves? Did it matter, what kind of journal it was or how influential it was?
Yeah, we saw some interesting patterns there. Special education journals were more likely to report fidelity, about 63%, compared to general education journals, which were at 40%.
That's pretty different.
It is. But when we zoomed out and looked at the main category of the journal, like was it an education journal, a psychology journal, or something else, that didn't seem to matter as much statistically.
Interesting. Why do you think those special education journals were more focused on fidelity?
Well, maybe it's because that field tends to really emphasize the nitty-gritty of how you implement interventions,
Hmm.
especially for students who learn differently. It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, they're often dealing with more individualized approaches and unique needs. Makes sense they'd care about the specifics.
Now, as for the journal's impact factor, which basically tells you how influential it is, we did notice that journals publishing studies that reported fidelity had a slightly higher average impact factor.
Okay.
We couldn't say for sure if that was statistically significant, with the data we had, but it might suggest that those journals with a bigger audience and more sway might prefer publishing studies that are like super rigorous, which would include that fidelity data.
Makes sense. They want to showcase the best of the best. What about how long the intervention itself was? Did studies with longer programs report fidelity more often?
Surprisingly, nope.
Hmm.
We didn't find a strong link between the length of the intervention and whether or not they reported fidelity. So the takeaway there is that the number of sessions, whether it was a shorter program or a longer one, it didn't really tell you if they were keeping tabs on how well it was delivered.
Okay, so now we know how often they reported it or didn't. Next question. For those studies that did report treatment fidelity, what did they do to actually support it? Like, what kind of training and help did they give to the people actually running the interventions?
Right, because just measuring fidelity isn't enough. You want to see if the researchers actually helped the teachers and whatnot do a good job. And good news, a good chunk of those studies, 77% of them actually, they talked about providing training. So that's a positive sign that they're thinking about this stuff.
Good to hear. What did that training usually look like?
The most common approach, and this is important to keep in mind, was to have some initial training led by the research team or whoever created the program. That happened in 76% of the studies that reported fidelity. And then, after that initial training, often they'd keep providing support while the intervention was going on, which happened in about 60% of the studies.
So like follow-up coaching and check-ins.
Exactly.
Can you give us an example of what that kind of training and support might look like in the real world?
Sure. One study, it was by O'Connor and his colleagues back in 2014. They had a pretty thorough system. So they started with a 4-hour training, like a big kickoff, and then every other month they'd have these 2-hour follow-up meetings, all led by the research team so everyone's on the same page. And that kind of ongoing support, it's really helpful, you know? It can
Oh,
help catch any problems that pop up and make sure everyone's still doing the program correctly, which is something to think about if you're implementing programs yourself.
yeah, that one and done training, it probably isn't enough to keep things running smoothly.
Nope, not at all.
You also mentioned that the amount of training varied quite a bit across the studies.
Oh yeah, huge range. Some studies had initial training that was only 5 hours or even less, while others had a whopping 25 hours or more.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is, which shows there's no real standard. But, how much training you need probably depends on how complicated the intervention is. So for you listening, pay attention to how much training they gave and think about whether it seems like enough for that particular program.
Yeah, good point. What about testing the teachers or whoever was doing the teaching? Did the studies check if they actually understood the intervention before they started working with kids?
That was less common than you might think. Only 16% of the studies that reported fidelity even mentioned assessing the implementer's knowledge or skills beforehand.
Seems like that would be a good idea.
Right. One example that stood out was a study by Lane and his colleagues back in 2009. They used these mock lessons to see if the people delivering the intervention can do it right. Assessing that kind of readiness, it just seems like a smart move to boost fidelity.
It does. And you mentioned earlier that sometimes the studies weren't super clear about the details of the ongoing support.
Totally. So yeah, 60% of the studies mentioned ongoing support, which sounds good, but less than half of those actually said how much time they spent on it. So more specifics there would really help understand, how intense and what kind of support you need to keep that fidelity.
Yeah, that would be helpful information. Okay, so training's often mentioned, but those pre-assessments and clear reporting on the ongoing support, those are areas where the research could be stronger. Now let's shift gears and talk about how they actually measured treatment fidelity. What were the go-to methods?
Well, the superstar was definitely observations.
Like watching what was going on in the classroom.
Yep. About 90% of the studies that reported fidelity, they used direct observations. Could be live, video recordings, or audio recordings, but they were watching or listening to those intervention sessions. And that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because seeing or hearing what's actually happening is usually considered the best way to know if they're doing the intervention as planned.
Yeah, seems like the most direct way to check. Did they use any other methods besides observations?
Some did. A few studies used what are called self-report measures. So, for instance, Graham and his team in 2002, they had teachers basically check off if they completed all the steps in each lesson. Those self-reports can be useful, but observations are thought to be more objective and therefore more reliable for you to consider, less chance of bias creeping in.
Makes sense. What about how often they observed and for how long? Was there a typical way of doing it?
Not really. It was all over the place. The number of observations varied a lot, from just one observation to as many as 35 per implementer. The length of the observations also varied, but most of them were between 16 and 30 minutes, which often matched the length of the actual intervention session, so no clear-cut standard there.
Okay, so a bit of a mix and match approach. And how did the researchers make sure those observations were accurate, that the people observing were seeing things the same way?
That's a really important question to think about when you're evaluating these studies. So they should ideally have multiple people observe and then compare notes, right? And this is measured by something called inter-observer agreement, which basically tells you how much those observers agreed on what they saw. But here's the thing. It was only reported in 43% of the studies that used observations.
Oh, so less than half?
Yep. Now, the good news is, in those studies that did report it, the agreement was generally high. Like 63% of them had agreement above 90%, which suggests that when they did check, things were pretty consistent. But the fact that more than half didn't even mention it, that raises a red flag.
Yeah, definitely makes you wonder how reliable those observations really were. All right, let's talk about those different parts of treatment fidelity, those dimensions you mentioned earlier. You talked about adherence, quality, and dosage. What did the studies tend to focus on measuring?
So researchers like Dane and Schneider back in 1998, They broke treatment fidelity down into 5 key pieces. Adherence, which is basically, did they do what they were supposed to do? Quality, meaning how well did they do it? Receipt, which is about the student's response, did they get it? Dosage, meaning how much of the intervention did they get? And then differentiation, meaning was the treatment group actually getting something different from the control group?
Okay, so 5 different ways to look at fidelity.
Right. And when we look at these studies, there was a very clear favorite: adherence. It was the most commonly reported dimension by far. 72% of those 83 studies that reported fidelity, they only reported on adherence, and almost 90% included it in their measurements.
Wow, a really strong focus on just that one aspect. What about those other dimensions, like how well the teaching was done or how the kids were responding? Were those less common?
Oh, way less common, which is important to note. Quality was the next most popular, but only 1 study reported solely on quality, and only 13 studies reported it along with other measures. Dosage and receipt were even less common. And treatment differentiation, which is all about making sure the intervention group actually got something unique, that was pretty rare.
And that differentiation piece, that's really crucial, right? To be sure that any positive results are actually because of the intervention itself.
Exactly. You don't want those good outcomes to just be because the treatment group got any extra attention. We found only 2 studies that actually measured that directly using a standardized observation tool.
Seems like a pretty big gap. If you don't check if the groups are truly getting different experiences, it's hard to know what's really working. So what about the actual levels of fidelity that were reported? Were the interventions generally implemented well, or did they find a lot of problems?
Overall, those studies that did report on fidelity levels generally painted a pretty rosy picture. 86% of the studies that gave numbers, and most of them did, their average adherence score was really high. Like
Yes.
77% of them were at 90% or higher. Even the studies that just described fidelity without numbers, they usually said things like, oh, fidelity was high, or there weren't any major deviations from the program.
So based on the studies that reported it, it seems like most of them were doing a pretty good job of sticking to the plan. But given that they were mostly focused on adherence and maybe there's some bias in what they chose to report, it's something to be a little cautious about. What about consistency across different teachers or whoever was delivering the intervention? Did they look at that?
Yeah, we looked at that too. A little less than half of the studies, about 49%, they reported whether the level of fidelity was consistent across all the different implementers. And this is something to consider because, let's be real, not everyone's going to teach a program in exactly the same way. Often, they describe this variation using, like, standard deviation or the range of fidelity scores across the different teachers or tutors.
Okay, so now we've got a better sense of how often fidelity was reported, how they tried to support it, how they measured it, and what they typically found. But the million-dollar question is, did treatment fidelity actually matter for student outcomes? Like, did higher fidelity lead to kids getting better at reading? That was the big question, right?
It was, and this is where the findings get super interesting, but also the data gets a little thin. So only a tiny fraction of the studies that reported fidelity, just 5% of them, or 4 studies out of those 83, actually used their fidelity data to see if it was related to how much the students improved in reading.
Only 4. That's so few.
I know, right? Especially given how important we've said fidelity is.
Yeah, it is surprising.
But here's the thing. The findings from those 4 studies, they're pretty compelling. 3 out of the 4 actually found a link between higher treatment fidelity and better reading outcomes for the students.
That's huge. Can you tell us more about what those studies actually showed?
Yeah, so one study by Fidelity and Sanders in 2009, they looked at students in grades 2 and 3 with reading difficulties. And they found that both adherence, following the program steps, and the quality of the teaching, they both predicted how much the students improved. Then there was another study, Fidelity and others in 2015, this time with kindergartners who were at risk for reading problems, and they found that fidelity actually moderated the treatment effects, which basically means the program worked better when it was implemented with higher adherence. And Nunnery and his colleagues back in 2006, their study found that even though overall fidelity didn't predict outcomes for the whole group, higher fidelity was linked to better results for students with disabilities.
So even though only a handful of studies actually looked at this directly, it seems like how well an intervention is done really can make or break its success for kids.
Absolutely.
Why do you think so few studies bother on to analyze this connection, though? It seems like a pretty important thing to know.
It's a good question. Maybe one reason is that a lot of these studies were designed to test if an intervention could work under perfect conditions, what we call efficacy trials.
Right.
And in those types of studies, researchers are super focused on keeping fidelity high and consistent. So they might not be as interested in what happens when fidelity varies. Could be that studies that look at how interventions work in real-world settings, effectiveness trials, those might be more likely to explore this relationship.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So to sum it all up, treatment fidelity, it's a big deal. It's key for understanding if a reading intervention truly works and if it can be used successfully in different schools and classrooms. But what we found is it's not reported as often as it should be in research on early reading interventions. And when it is reported, the focus is often just on whether or not they followed the steps. And maybe surprisingly, they don't often explore how well the intervention is delivered and how that's connected to student learning.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And the big takeaway here is that those few studies that did look at the link between fidelity and outcomes, they often found that it really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Doing these reading programs the way they were designed, it can lead to better results for those young readers.
Absolutely.
So it's not just what you choose to do to help those kids with reading, but how you actually do it that makes a real difference.
Definitely food for thought. So, for everyone listening, as you're looking at this research, or maybe even putting programs into practice yourselves, think about how these findings apply to you. Whether you're reading a research article or working in a school, what happens when you just assume something is being done right? What questions does all this raise for you about creating effective learning environments?
Maybe it'll make you a more critical reader of research, always looking for information about how well those interventions were actually implemented. Or maybe it'll inspire you to think about how you can better support and monitor fidelity in any programs you might be involved in.
Exactly. And if you want to dive deeper into any of the specific research we've talked about today, check out the original article that this deep dive is based on. It's a fantastic starting point and has references to many of those individual studies we've discussed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.